Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Intro to Tech Equity webinar. We're going to give it just a couple of minutes as we wait for some arrivals to get into the door. Just hang tight. We'll get started in about a minute or two, and I'll keep repeating this message a couple of times. Hello, for those of you just joining us, we're going to get started in about 1 minute. We're just waiting for the room to fill in, waiting for some late arrivals. Just give us a second. We'll get started shortly. Hello, welcome to those of you just joining us. We're going to get started in a couple of minutes. We're just waiting for the room to fill in. We'll hear this message a couple of times. Just hang tight. We're going to get started in a couple of minutes. Okay, we're going to go ahead and get started. I want to welcome all of you. Hope you all can hear and see me. My name is Herman Calderon. I'm the community manager at TechEquity Collaborative. And so in my role, I get to engage with our supporters through events, volunteer opportunities, through campaigns, and I get to engage with you all here. So feel free to drop in any questions into the Q&A box on the bottom of your screens as we go, but we won't answer any of those until the end. The webinar is recorded, and we'll share the recording along with the presentation slides afterwards to all of you in your emails, so you can share that out, or if you missed something, you can go back and look at it. So a little bit about what we'll be talking about today. We'll talk about why TechEquity exists as an organization and how we got started. We'll talk about the key issues we've identified to help us understand the problems that need to be solved. And we'll talk about how we can take action to address some of our most pressing economic issues. So let's talk about why we're here. Well, TechEquity got started because some of its founders and early members saw symptoms of growing inequity within their neighborhoods and understood that there was this perception that tech workers were the cause of the problem. So very similar to what we're experiencing today. Years ago, they noticed rising rents, increases in displacement, traffic, and people experiencing homelessness all around them. And as they talked to others, they realized that they weren't alone in their concerns, and that they as tech workers were uniquely positioned to help contribute to some solutions that would address what they were seeing on a day-to-day basis. And especially now in the face of the pandemic, we're seeing that the affordability crisis gets so much worse with an increased burden placed on lower income people and communities of color. And many of our neighbors are uncertain as to how they'll continue to manage what was already an untenable situation. And at the same time, tech workers have remained relatively unscathed. So as a result, the pandemic has the potential to even further exacerbate inequality in our region. Like I said, that some of our founders and early members were seeing from years and years ago. So because of this affordability crisis, communities are frustrated, and it really comes to no surprise. I know for myself, I've grown up in the Bay Area my whole life, and I've been able to see both sides of the coin, right? I have friends and family who are worried about the changes they're seeing in their communities, and where they're going to live, where they're going to work, how can they afford for food, how can they afford a mortgage payment, how can they afford a car payment, and it's really stressful, right? But I also have friends and family who are within the tech industry and are finding lots of success for themselves and for their families alike. However, we see that when tech shoulders the blame, it starts to create this us versus them dynamic that's further dividing communities. And we know that tech workers care and that they want to help and that they don't want to contribute to this deepening divide within our region. And while we're all unsure as to how long we'll be managing this new normal that was caused by the pandemic, I think it's important to note that many within the tech sector remained relatively unscathed. More than most other sectors, tech really was able to make that transition to working from home with little to no disruption. And now more than ever, tech workers and tech companies have this opportunity to support more equitable solutions in our communities. And we have an opportunity to use our unique positions of privilege to support our neighbors, but it can be hard to know how to best engage within our communities in times of such uncertainty. So this is the state of the affordability crisis in the Bay Area. And the fact that rents are rising, I don't think is a surprise to anyone on this call, because we all know this, we feel this, we've heard this from friends and families, or we're experiencing it ourselves. And while some Californians are very successful in the tech-driven economy here, the average salaries for tenants have actually decreased slightly. So we're showing stats for California because that's where we're based as a organization, and it's where tech is headquartered. But a version of this story is playing out all across the country. And it really is a sharp contrast with the narrative of tech success, and without tech at the table to work together to address our shared crisis, it's understandable as to why communities are frustrated, like we just talked about. And just to give a little bit of a glimpse with the pandemic, before the pandemic, unemployment was hovering just around 4%, and people were struggling to make ends meet. And when the virus hit, unemployment claims had spiked to 16%, which is a more drastic spike than our last recession in 2008. So in the span of a month, we lost decades worth of recovery. And as instability and uncertainty continues, we'll see more of our neighbors being pushed into homelessness or worse. At TechEquity Collaborative, we're as optimistic as ever about the tech industry's potential to drive broad-based growth that's accessible to everyone, but it's clear that it's not going to happen on its own. We have to invest in the people and the institutions that are serving our communities, and we have to show up. We have to do so in partnership with those in the community that are feeling the most pain if we're to dismantle this notion that tech is the enemy. At TechEquity, we believe that a more engaged tech sector is a more ethical tech sector, that connecting tech workers and companies to issues where they live in will result in more ethical decisions at work and more engagement in our communities. And we know we can do this, and the first step is to show up. And you all have done a great first step today by signing on to this webinar and learning a little bit more about how to plug in. So our goal at TechEquity really is to change the conditions in which the tech sector is growing. We believe that structural change will eliminate a culture and policies that have institutionalized inequity, leading to stronger and more resilient communities. And we help tech workers approach these big problems and engage in the system change in three major ways. Our programs educate you about the most critical civic issues where you live. And we do this through a variety of ways. Excuse me. We hold book club discussions, panel discussions with experts in whatever field of topic that we're choosing to discuss. We host webinars such as these, and we produce voter guides around election season. We also advocate for public policy that rebalances power and builds economic equity. And a perfect example of that is in 2019. We worked on the Tenant Protection Act of 2019, which really was a coalition effort of community members, community organizations, legislators, and a wide range of people who helped fight to bring and extend protections to 8 million California renters to prevent unjust evictions and price gouging of rents. And finally, we work with companies. So there's corporate practice aiming to turn companies into agents of change and equity in the broader community. And we do this through our corporate partnerships program and engagements that we have with companies. And tech workers have outsized political power that's largely been untapped to when it comes to public policy advocacy. So connecting tech workers to outside perspectives not only builds more empathy and ethical practices in our workplaces, in our products, and in our surrounding communities. So at TechEquity, our two issue areas are housing and workforce and labor. While housing parts are a core part of this, and we always hear housing first when we think about affordability, the issues really are intertwined and intersect in a variety of ways, because where you live affects your access to opportunity, and what job you have affects where you're able to afford to live. Our goal at TechEquity is bold and comprehensive change by companies and government that's led by the tech workforce. And as we discussed earlier, these issues have only gotten more urgent in the face of the pandemic, but we're all well positioned to adapt our agenda to these new realities. And while the pandemic exposed some of the cracks in our economy, these underlying issues have always existed in our economy for decades. So let's learn a little bit more about inequity within our own neighborhoods and the history of those inequities. Well, the affordability crisis is decades in the making, and the policy choices that we've made over the course of decades has set us up for this level of pain that our community is feeling, especially now more amplified with the results of the pandemic. So in the 1930s, the federal government instituted a policy that's still felt today, especially by communities of color in the Bay Area, in California, and all across the country. And that policy is redlining. So redlining was a process in which the Homeowners Loan Corporation, a federal agency, gave neighborhoods ratings to guide investment. And this policy is named for the red or hazardous neighborhoods that were deemed the riskiest. So on maps, those neighborhoods were literally redlined. And those communities that were deemed risky investments or redlined didn't receive any investments. So the image you have on your screen is an image of San Francisco. And all those red blocks are examples of redline neighborhoods, historically redline neighborhoods within the city. And these neighborhoods were predominantly home to communities of color, and that really is by no accident. The hazardous ratings were in large part based on racial demographics. In other words, redlining was a discriminatory and a racist policy, and it made it hard for residents to get loans for home ownership or maintenance of their homes for something like building a new roof or just upkeeping the home itself. And consequently, redlining led to cycles of disinvestment, including development and production within these neighborhoods. So there's a terrible history of underinvestment, underbuilding, and exclusion in our country. And often those communities that have been historically underinvested in and have been redlined are the very same communities that are at risk of gentrification today. The crisis we're living in is decades in the making, way before tech, right? It predates tech's arrival. And it's not unique to the Bay Area. It extends, like we talked about, all across California and all across the country. So these are examples on your screen of redline neighborhoods in Austin and Atlanta, right? We hear of Austin and Atlanta as two up and coming tech centers apart from Silicon Valley and the Bay Area. But both cities also have a history of redline neighborhoods within their city. So by preventing entire neighborhoods from accessing capital, these neighborhoods were unable to build the schools that they needed, small businesses, and a community that fostered economic success and opportunity. And it caused many of the people who lived in redline neighborhoods for generations to fall in and stay in liquid asset poverty. Now, you may be asking yourselves, so what is liquid asset poverty? Well, someone is considered to be in liquid asset poverty if they don't have enough savings to cover their basic expenses for 3 months after experiencing an income shock. And then an income shock can be something like your rent suddenly goes up, from one month to the other. You suddenly lose your job. Someone hits your card and you suddenly have this huge bill, right? And it impacts almost 1 out of 3 Californians. So 33.9% of Californians are living in liquid asset poverty, and people of color and lower income people are affected at much higher rates, with 41.2% of African American households in liquid asset poverty and 56.2% of Latino households in liquid asset poverty. And there really isn't a single reason as to why this is all happening. Many years of policy decisions have led to these outcomes, which are especially burdensome for communities of color. And these policies have often predated tech's arrival, but tech workers can now take a role in supporting better policies moving forward. And the twin forces of a housing shortage, particularly with affordable housing and wages that don't cover the cost of living, have created a regional crisis that has hindered opportunity, growth, and prosperity for families and businesses alike. And as you can imagine, the statistics we're showing today will likely be impacted by the outcomes of the pandemic. As we've said, many people in our communities were already struggling. And as pandemic recovery continues to be starkly uneven and unequal, many of our neighbors are facing increased instability and likely will for years to come if we don't implement the necessary solutions now. And as we can see, the hourly pay for workers has not increased much the last couple of decades, even though productivity has dramatically increased. So According to the Economic Policy Institute, the share of workers covered by a collective bargaining agreement or unions dropped from 27% to 11.6% between 1979 and 2019, meaning that the union coverage rate is now less than half where it was 40 years ago. It means that employees have less bargaining power to advocate for pay rates in alignment with what the work that they are delivering. And while all workers have lost out, because of this, Black, Indigenous, and people of color are the most impacted. And while there's a gap between worker pay and productivity, like we just talked about, there's also a pay gap between race. So white men are earning more cents to the dollar, it's that orange bar on the left side of your screen, in comparison to Black men and women, the two blue bars on the right side of your screen. And because Black, Indigenous, and people of color are getting paid less and disproportionately, they're not able to afford living in the cities that are providing these good jobs. So the costs of living here were already high. So let's take a look at how a worker earning minimum wage fares in the current rental market. So this is what it would take to afford an average two-bedroom apartment in San Francisco. So if you're making around $133,000 a year, you can afford the average two-bedroom working a regular 8-hour day, right? However, if you're making minimum wage in San Francisco, you need to be working 40 hours a day to afford that two-bedroom. Again, if you're making minimum wage, you need to be working 40 hours a day to afford that two-bedroom. So there's only 24 hours in a day. So we're setting up this impossible situation for low-wage workers to be able to afford living in the city where they work. And this problem persists all across the country. Even though costs in up-and-coming tech cities like Austin, Denver, and Atlanta aren't as high as the Bay Area or California, the cost of living there is still unreasonable for anyone that's earning minimum wage. And in San Francisco, it's not just people outside the tech sector that are struggling to afford the city. There's this common misconception that all tech workers are paid these lavish salaries. However, not every salaried employee is making six figures. Some salaried tech employees, like those in customer success or marketing, are paid salaries that are still considered to be low income in the Bay Area. And even further away from this image of a wealthy tech worker are the thousands of contractors and contingent workers like security guards, custodians, cooks, and bus drivers who are working long hours to maintain tech companies, but are receiving minimum benefits and are not paid as much. So you have to have a good salary to afford your apartment, but why is your apartment so expensive to begin with? Well, rents are going up due in part to lack of supply, and this chart is showing us what we should be building. So the state sets goals for how much housing local communities should build in order to keep up with demand and population growth. And these are called RHNA goals, RHNA, and that stands for Regional Housing Needs Allocation. And as you can see, we're doing a pretty good job at meeting our RHNA goal for the above moderate income housing. That's that big blue bracket on the right side of your screen. And that's affordable for people making that good salary that we just talked about. But we're not building anywhere close enough homes for people in the lower and moderate income bracket. So those are the two small red bars on the left side of your screen. So as housing costs have skyrocketed with production of affordable housing not being matched, working class residents and communities of color have been driven out of our urban core and pushed into the outer edges of our region, further away from job centers and supportive services, and some residents have been displaced from the region altogether. So remember, when someone tells you that we just need to build more housing, it's important that we ask them, build more housing for whom? Again, we're not building enough housing at lower levels of affordability. And because we're not building enough housing that's affordable for lower and middle income people, they're leaving our communities while folks with higher incomes are coming in and staying in. So this chart is showing us how people in lower incomes, so those are the orange bars, have left San Francisco at higher rates, while people with higher incomes have increased migration into the city. And people beneath 30% AMI are in a more drastic situation, where they can't even afford to leave San Francisco as they're being pushed into homelessness or worse. So that's why actually that last blue bar is actually increasing, because there just isn't enough affordable housing available to help support the most vulnerable members in our community. And amongst people of color, the rates of displacement are even more tragic. As we talked about earlier, Black and Latino populations are living in liquid asset poverty at higher rates. Furthermore, Black and Latino populations have been leaving San Francisco as well at higher rates over the past couple of years. And it's really a combination of discriminatory housing laws, low wages, lack of affordable housing that really have created this crisis of displacement that we're seeing. And so displacement is driven by policy choices, and we may see this ratio continue to rise as the pandemic continues to progress. As we said, the folks that are the most rent burdened are in low wage jobs, and low wage jobs were the ones that were getting hit the hardest by this crisis. And we can't build our way out to solve our problems, but it is true that we don't have enough homes for people. So the good news is that members at TechEquity are showing up for the community. Tech workers are members of the community and should be at the table working together alongside non-tech community members. And together we can advocate for solutions to our most pressing shared problems. And we have to work together to address these underlying issues that are driving inequity within our tech economy. So as you can see, the affordability crisis we're living out today is a result of years of bad policy choices. And the good news is that we can make a different set of choices moving forward. So at TechEquity, we envision a world where a growing tech-driven economy creates opportunity for everyone, and where tech sector employees and companies are engaged and active participants in making our communities a better place to live. And we've identified the structural changes that need to happen in order to achieve this vision, but we won't be able to achieve it without the necessary policy change. So in the housing world, here's what we've identified. We need to take an above all approach to tackling our housing affordability crisis, and that starts with production. So building more housing, specifically at lower levels of affordability. And we can do this through zoning and permitting reform that brings down the cost of constructing housing by removing delays and lengthy administrative processes that make it too expensive to build. Preservation, making sure that we're providing more resources to subsidize and maintain and improve existing affordable housing. Protection, we need to protect existing tenants from displacement. It's going to take a long time to build the housing that we need, but in the meantime, we need to protect existing tenants, from being evicted, displaced, etc. Racial equity. Racism is embedded in our economic, political, and social systems. It's embedded in us all, and especially within housing. And that means that we have to be explicit about how racism and racial bias are upheld in housing. So we have to craft policy solutions that are building racial equity in response. And especially now, we need to be thinking about short and long-term solutions to preservation and protection, because many of our neighbors are at risk more than ever as a result of the pandemic. And so here's what we identified in the corporate world. We need to make sure that we all get enough compensation and benefits to live a healthy and lifestyle. We want to ensure that companies are doing their part to contribute to the communities they exist within, that people in the surrounding communities are able to access these jobs, and that these jobs are paying fair wages and benefits regardless of the role you're in. We need to make sure that all workers are protected. Within the tech sector, we see large disparities emerge between headquarters, warehouse, and contracted workers. So in partnership with Silicon Valley Rising, we created a standard that tech companies should implement for contract workers, which includes creating space for workers to have a voice, providing career mobility opportunities, good wages and benefits, and making sure the workplace is safe and ensuring that there is fair scheduling. We need to expand and equip the workforce. So training as a standalone approach is not going to lead us out of inequality, and it's not going to guarantee employment for most displaced workers. In order to solve this crisis, we have to undertake multiple strategies, right? Massive job programs, higher labor standards, and protections for all jobs, innovative recruitment, training, and development of new and diverse talent. At the same time, the tech industry has an imperative to make its employee base more representative of the population at large, and not just to create broader economic opportunity, but because companies with diverse representation at all levels are more likely to be successful than those that aren't. And last, we need to make sure that everyone's basic needs are met. We need a new social contract that ensures that everyone has the basics to survive. And we must strengthen our social safety net so as no one falls through the cracks. So once again, there are tons of ways for you to get involved. We host educational events and social events. If you're interested in public policy, we have our policy agenda for the year, and we post that every year. And there's always opportunities to get involved with statewide legislation, local legislation. For corporate practice, we offer a wide range of services and provide ways for companies to get involved on issues from employee engagement to policy advising. So you can reply to that follow-up email I'll be sending out afterwards, and I can connect you with our corporate partnerships manager. And so this is how we work. We try to make it as easy as possible to plug in, but making sure that we're continuing to build community in the process. So this year for us, our key initiatives really began with the Contract Worker Disparity Project, which was a first of its kind worker-centered initiative that helped shed the light on the practice of contracting out and proposes and advocates for public policy solutions and partners with companies to adopt responsible contracting practices. We also had the Tech Bias in Housing Initiative, which examines the promise and perils of housing technology. So we aim to ensure that technological innovations in the housing space do not reinforce the housing systems and policies of the past. Passing economic justice policy. Every year, TechEquity introduces a bold policy agenda to address economic inequality in the housing market and in the workplace. And our priorities this year are housing data transparency, equitable labor standards, affordable housing, data surveillance, protections, and more. And finally, we have the System Reset Initiative, which is helping tech companies create on-ramps for people returning from incarceration. So we're partnering with justice-involved people and organizations to get system reset into every tech company in California. So what can you do today? You can do 3 things right after you get off this call. You can tell a friend about our work. You can sign up for a community conversation, which really is just a one-on-one conversation between yourself and me. And really, we just get to talk about your journey here at TechEquity. If you have any questions and more in depth, it's a good stepping stone to see how you want to participate with the organization. And finally, you can take action with us by becoming, a volunteer, supporting one of our legislations. And I just wanted to talk about one piece of legislation that we were working on this year. So SB 1162, or the Pay Transparency for Pay Equity Act, was one of our priority legislation pieces for the year. And it made it so that all reports make pay equity reports public so that workers have the information that they need to ensure that there's equal pay for equal work. It ensures that companies create a fair and equal playing field for all workers, posting salaries in the job description and posting promotional opportunities to their existing employees before selecting a candidate. So currently, the bill made it all the way through the legislative process. It's currently sitting at the governor's next, so hopefully he signs it into law. Once again, it's SB 1162. But for example, for this bill, we had people call in, give statements of support. We had people email, sign petitions, and participate in a variety of ways since March up until now, until the governor signs it. So there's tons of ways. If you're interested in getting involved in work like this, there are opportunities available. And on events, we host tons of events. So if you head on to our events page, you'll see events we have coming up and past events, as long as past event recordings. If you're interested in something we did in the past, we link all the recordings to the event on our events page. So like I said, you can do 3 things right after you get off this call. Tell a friend about our work, sign up for a one-on-one with me. We can talk a little bit more personally, or you can take action, on one of our bills. So I'm sure that was quite a bit of information. So want to take a second, take a minute, see if there's any questions. But like I said, we'll be sending out the recording as well as the presentation slides to each and every one of you sometime this afternoon. So just take a second. And then also, if you have any questions afterwards, please respond back to that email and I'll happily answer anything. I'm not seeing anything, totally fine. So I want to just thank you all for hopping on today. We hope you feel inspired to join the growing movement. Keep an eye out for that email. And if you do want to talk personally, one-on-one, I'm down for it. My schedule is always open. Just respond back to that email. Hope you all have a great weekend. Thanks for joining and hope to see you in a future volunteer opportunity or event. Thank you.